Well, hello, my name's Jen Charteris. I'm speaking to you from the north of England, a place called Newcastle, which is almost in Scotland, just the other side of the border from Scotland. I'm speaking to you from where our church is now live streamed as of the last few weeks. And behind me, we've got some flowers, and I haven't put them there just for ELF seminars. We have a sort of running fun thing in our church where people keep delivering flowers so that they can be on the live stream on a Sunday morning, and we get to enjoy them here at ELF as well. Just to briefly introduce a bit about my background, I have just over the last 2 years taken on the leadership of an organisation called Crostons. We provide in-context theological training for people who would never be able to go to a residential seminary. But prior to that, I had more than 25 years working in industry as a management consultant. And the material that we are going to work through today is based on an interest that developed as I was working with senior leaders and recognizing that there were some really big differences in the extent to which people seemed resilient to things. And became curious about whether what those differences was about, and whether that was an easy thing to train and learn or not. But I came to it also as a Christian person. And so whilst I've spent a lot of time looking at the research and the tools and models from the secular world, I have always wanted to make sure that that sits under the authority of Scripture. And the headline conclusion on this is that as believers, we have far more confidence than anybody in the secular world can possibly have, and great reason for resilience. But resilience is not an automatic thing, and is something that can be worked at. But as Christians, a biblical perspective gives us so much more to reach for in this whole arena. Let me explain briefly what we're going to go through here. Here's what we're aiming to cover. So I'm going to do a little bit of work on definitions of resilience, even a brief look at some of the history of that, and the secular landscape on resilience, but where the gospel perspective is so much better. The heart of what we're going to spend our hour on is going through what I would call a bit of a workout, where we walk through some of the components of resilience. And you may want to think about this in relation to yourself, the sort of ways in which you might be able to work on developing greater resilience. But equally, you may be thinking about this from the point of view of other people. So people in your ministry, people in your organization that you lead, perhaps family members, how can I help others? But behind all of that, or alongside all of that, I want to encourage you to think about how some of this territory, how some of this material might be quite a useful tool for engaging other people with the gospel. So in my secular consulting career, many of the best opportunities I've had to share the gospel with people, to share the hope I have in Christ and how that might be relevant for them, has been in the context of talking about some of the areas that we're going to look at today. So I hope it's useful from a number of perspectives. I want to invite you to think about this all quite critically as well. And I mean critical in the sense of think hard about it, put it under a gospel lens. Let me tell you one of my big assumptions here. My big assumption is that there is valuable stuff to be learned from secular research, from fields like this in the secular world, but that the gospel will always go further, be better, and that sometimes the secular stuff takes us in the wrong direction. So we've got to think hard about the material that we're looking at, but I think it can offer us a great deal of value, and so let's get into it from there. If you were to pause for a moment and think of somebody that you see as resilient, I wonder what sort of demands or challenges they face. You know, why are you saying they're being resilient? It's usually in response to a set of demands and challenges. What sort of things do you notice them saying that indicates resilience? What's the kind of evidence? What are you seeing that suggests to you resilience? And then what underlying factors do you attribute their apparent resilience to? So where does their resilience appear to come from? So I could answer this by saying my mum, who is 79 and not in great health, is nonetheless one of the most resilient people that I know. And she has an extraordinary capacity to deal with significant challenges. And for her, it's fundamentally based on the fact that she is a believer, so she knows who she is in Christ. And then she takes that and is able to bring that perspective to bear in all sorts of very trying situations. But there are other factors that are at play in all of that as well. But as you've thought of, somebody you may think of resilience, you might have thought about their resilience as being the ability to keep going over time. So we sometimes resilience is a long-term thing. That's one sort of part of the definition of resilience. Sometimes we're thinking about somebody as resilient because they've coped with an incredibly intense challenge or demand, the sort of survival of intense heat. In my former career, I've had the privilege of working alongside leaders enduring incredibly challenging situations, and just watching how they keep perspective in that has been a privilege. Or you might have thought of somebody as resilient when they bounce back from things, somebody who just has the capacity to encounter difficult things but find a way back. And I could think of another family member who perhaps represents that kind of resilience. No matter how difficult things get and how down she may get at times, she has an ability to bounce back over that. So there are different sort of facets to resilience. I'm going to very briefly touch on where the whole sort of field of resilience thinking and resilience study comes from. If we had a longer workshop, we can go into this a little bit more detail, but over time in the whole area of personal development, psychology and so on, we've moved from in the past a very disease-based model, sort of fixing illnesses, mental illnesses and so on, to something that gradually moved to a more sort of positive approach, a sort of human potential, self-esteemed movement that developed into sort of positive psychology. We've seen in recent decades mindfulness becoming a sort of mainstream idea. And where we are today is a really confusing picture, actually, because we've seen the advance of neuroscience. There's a lot of work being done on sports performance psychology, growth mindset work, all of that kind of thing. And yet we have a mental health epidemic, really, just extraordinary sort of breakdown in mental health and enormous problems of that. And perhaps this is not true where you are, but certainly in our context, a whole sort of culture of victimhood and offendedness that has come into play. So where is resilience in all of that? Well, let's build up towards this. What I'm going to do here is take you through a definition that comes from one of the editors of a publication called Psychology Today. And as I read through this, what I want you to just think about is what are the faulty assumptions that are anti-gospel, that are without God in all of this? But also, to what extent are there little sunbeams of common grace that people might be able to, that might give you an opportunity to engage with people in the question of resilience? So here's the statement. At the heart of resilience is a belief in oneself, yet also a belief in something larger than oneself. Resilient people do not let adversity define them. They find resilience by moving towards a goal beyond themselves, transcending pain and grief by perceiving bad times as a temporary state of affairs. It's possible to strengthen your inner self and your belief in yourself, to define yourself as capable and competent. It's possible to fortify your psyche. It's also possible to develop a sense of mastery. Well, there are so many layers of that I would love to unpack, and if we were all in a room together, we'd spend a bit of time unpacking this together. But there's real idolatry of the self tied up in this, isn't there? The sort of sense that belief in yourself is sort of fundamental, and you get to define yourself and so on. But this idea that actually a belief in something larger than oneself, that would be really interesting to engage on in a conversation. What might be larger than oneself that is big enough to help me to bounce back from enormous challenges and so on. What is the goal beyond myself that might transcend pain and grief? When I read that, I just want to open the book of Revelation and go, there's a new heaven and a new earth, and all pain and grief is going to pass away. And so there's real conflict in this statement that just expose, I guess, some of the poverty of thinking that is there if we don't have a heavenly and eternal a sovereign God perspective on all of this. Yeah, it's just worth understanding where some of the secular work on all of this tends to be coming from, to recognize that even within that there's an opportunity sometimes to engage people with, well, what might that be? So let me just go a little bit further in definitions. If you go to a dictionary, they might define resilience as being the capacity to recover quickly from difficulty, toughness. Sometimes it's described as the ability of a substance or an object to spring back into shape. So the idea of elasticity comes into that as well. From all the different sort of sources that I've looked into and engaged with over the years, I summarized a definition of this. So this is a kind of combination of different work. And I've suggested it might be this. So resilience is the capacity to deal successfully with the obstacles we encounter while maintaining our path towards life's goals. So let's just pick up on a few aspects of that. First of all, there are some assumptions in here, and one of those assumptions is capacity. And the big assumption is that it is possible for that capacity to go up as well as to drop down. And part of our role as leaders, or perhaps as parents or whatever it might be, is to notice when somebody's capacity may be depleted for a whole bunch of reasons. But also the positive thing here is that there are ways in which our capacity, we can build capacity to be more resilient. That's often a huge part of what discipleship is actually doing on one level. It's not the purpose of discipleship, but it is a side effect of discipleship. But there are just ways in which we care for people during difficult times and so on, which just help them get that capacity. So that the optimism of saying we can do something about capacity when it becomes depleted. Another assumption here is that we will encounter obstacles. And that's really fundamental to everything you might hear or read on resilience, which is a sense of realism about the fact that we will encounter obstacles is actually a very valuable starting point. And then another bit I'll just pick out of this, which is maintaining path towards our life's goals. And it assumes the existence of greater goals that are beyond the here and now. And one of the most astonishing things that I found in my work with leaders in secular organizations is how few people really have those. How few people have a sense of there being something bigger and more valuable beyond here and now. And again, as believers, that's an incredibly precious and valuable thing that we have. Something else I just want to touch on as we sort of set up definition things here is just make sure we don't assume that pressure is necessarily a bad thing. This is a very sort of simple representation of the idea that a certain degree of pressure can actually help us to raise performance. Sports psychologists know this really, really well. You know, they're elite sports coaches. I've worked with a number of them in my consulting work over the years. Elite sports coaches know that there is a kind of optimal level of stretch that is really going to get the best out of an athlete, but learn to look for the signs where it's kind of dropping over a level. And so if we're engaging with our children, for instance, or members of our staff team, helping them to recognize that pressure can actually be really valuable is a useful thing to be doing. I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So what I want to do is take us now, this is really the heart of our session, take you through what I've called a workout menu for building and maintaining resilience. So the big idea here is that we're thinking about building resilience as being training for a race. That's a very familiar metaphor to us, training as athletes, and recognizing that there are sort of different components to it. So I'm using this as a big metaphor. What I've done in doing this is pull together just a whole lot of research that has been done into components of resilience. So a big idea behind all of this is that resilience is a sort of net effect of many, many different things working together, and the mix will be slightly different for different people and at different times. And so you might want to go through this thinking about yourself, what's useful for me, or, you know, what are the aspects I might be working on with somebody I might be trying to support, or what do I need to foster in my team or culture or organization, and so on. So let me just do a quick overview of these, and then we'll dig into the detail. So one of the things that stands out most in all the studies on resilience is that there's a very, very powerful value in a purpose beyond myself. We saw that in that earlier definition that I read through, and it just comes through so clearly. How can we work with people on that? Perhaps people who are not believers as well. We'll come on to talking about that. Related to that is having a much bigger picture, and in particular seeing the long-term view, or having comparisons that help us to put things in perspective. And so I've defined that as stamina, the sort of distance training, if you like. And then agility, so flexibility, and seeing the choice that we do actually have in our thinking patterns. Learning to think about how we think is a really valuable thing that we can do. There's some physiological stuff, and I'm going to touch very, very briefly on the whole area of breathing and the brain. I'm not a neuroscientist, but there's an awful lot of really interesting work being done on this, and we'll cover that briefly. We'll have a look at the part that relationships play in resilience, and then just really simple well-being things. All of those are contributing factors. So if you just even have a look through that list before I've gone into the detail on those, you can see there are some things we can activate. There are things we can take initiative on to help ourselves to be more resilient, or to help other people we're more resilient. But as we go through this, I said earlier, I want you to be kind of thinking critically. Within all of this, look out as we go through for where some of the false idols, the potential for false idols might be. I'll draw attention to some of that. But also look out for where there may be gospel opportunities. And again, I'll flag some of those as we go through. So I've sort of this. So over the next few slides, you might be thinking about, you know, kind of the model itself, or the thinking itself. You might be making it much more personal. So in some cases, you might be thinking, what's helpful or relevant for me here right now, because I'm not feeling as resilient as I need to be for the work I'm doing right now. You might be thinking about others. So you might be thinking about your team, what's helpful or relevant in leading others. Or you might be thinking evangelistically, well, how might this help me create gospel opportunities? Yesterday evening, I think it was, Rico, if you were tuned into the live stream plenary, he asked you to listen as a river and not as a reservoir. And I thought that was brilliant. I absolutely loved his expression of that. So I'd encourage you to do that with this as well. So let's get on to thinking about the first of these areas. It's a core strength and having a purpose or beyond yourself. The questions I would be asking if I was with a group of secular leaders is, what are you rooted in? What ultimately matters, or what is your highest purpose? This generates brilliant conversations, because so few people outside the gospel have thought a great deal about this. And in one or two cases, I've seen people stopped in their tracks thinking about this. We can read, let me read to you from Jeremiah 17, 5-8. This is what the Lord says. Cursed is the one who trusts in man, who draws strength from mere flesh, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. That person will be like a bush in the wastelands. They will not see prosperity when it comes. They will dwell in the parched places of the desert, in a salt land where no one lives. But blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit. So what that passage from Jeremiah is talking about, there's a difference, and some of you will be familiar with the work of Paul Tripp and David Powlison, who talk about the difference between root and the relationship between root and fruit. What are we rooted in? What is our core strength coming on? And so we see this picture. If I was showing this to a secular group of leaders, I'd have to be careful in my context about reading from the Bible, but instead of that cross, I'd put a huge question mark and then take the opportunity to talk about what's in that question mark for me. So if we are rooted in our own strength, we're living in a desert, and destruction will follow. If we are rooted in Christ, then fruit will follow. And when the heat comes, probably be a sun at the top of that picture, but when the heat comes, the fruit will appear as opposed to being dried up. And so we get passages like this: praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, in his great mercy has given us birth into living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into inheritance that can never perish or spoil or fade, kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming salvation, and so on. That's core strength. Some people will talk about having a higher purpose of wanting to change the world, but really that is where our core strength comes from. But how can we engage other people in questions of core strength? Well, here are some of the discussion topics that you might get into with, you might have a group of people that you're working. I've sometimes run this as a sort of women's seminar, and getting into questions like what really matters to me, or what am I striving after, what dominates my conversation, what do I spend my time, energy and money on. Another way you can go about it, and again, if we had a longer seminar and we were all together, what I'd do is set a timer for just a couple of minutes and invite you to write about one of those questions. Pick one of those questions and write about it as fast as you can for 2 minutes. And I'd say to the group, I'm not going to force you to reveal what you've written. Don't worry about the grammar or the logic. Just relax, play, and keep writing fast. And it's a quick writing technique that's a wonderful way of getting to questions that people sometimes find a bit difficult to talk about. And another sort of factor in this is you could try it in the style of something a bit creative. So instead of just sort of writing about it, you might write it in the style of a postcard. I don't know even if we do those anymore, but or a letter to my kids or a letter from my older self. So just getting people into a conversation about what really matters to me can be a wonderful way of, first of all, exposing where people perhaps don't have that core purpose, that core strength, and there's a great evangelistic opportunity, or just connecting people back to it so that they feel positive about you know, what they do stand for and are reminded of. A friend of mine uses the term to gospel somebody, and she'll say, you know, Jen, gospel me on this. And what she's saying is remind me of the core things that really matter. Speak the gospel into this situation so that I'm grounded back in what really matters. So that's the core strength element. We've hurtled through it, but hopefully some ideas there that you might find of use. Related to that, I said the second thing was to have a longer term view or a bigger picture. So what the research says is that people who have an understanding of how the world looks from other perspectives will often be more resilient. There's a saying that says you should live in the best house you can afford to live in the worst area you can bear to live in. That's a secular point of view, by the way. I'm not promoting that as an idea, but it's about the idea that instead of sort of looking at all the people who are better than ourselves, but we see that a lot of people have things worse than us, it actually helps our resilience. The picture, and also having a long-term view on this, so taking a view over time, life has seasons, and the idea that this too will pass is a very, very powerful contributor to resilience. So when my second child was born, he's 18 now, he was very ill when he was born, and we were told that if he survived, there was a high chance that he would be severely disabled. Other people will have many, many stories like that. Many of you listening will have stories like this. And what you know is that that's the most intense period of time, but you can look back on it eventually and kind of go, it's not going, the crisis is not going to go on forever. We may live with a very different life than we had expected when our child was expected, but it will, we will find a way through it, and we'll find a new normal. That's going on for all of us at the moment. Coronavirus, we went into a crisis. We're not assuming that the world will ever be exactly as it was before, but we do know that the sense of crisis will pass, and we will find a new normal. And having that kind of long-term perspective. I've included this picture on the slide. It's the young hotelier from a film called The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, and I think it's one of the most gospel-centered statement from one of the least gospel films. And what it says is, everything will be, what he says at one point in the film, and it just jumped out to me the first time I ever heard it. He says, talking to an unhappy customer who says, and he says to her, everything will be all right in the end, and if it's not so, it's not all right, it's not yet the end. And I thought, well, that just summarizes the hope we have in heaven as Christian people. It will be all right in the end, and if it's not all right, it's not the end, and we look forward to a new heaven. So we have an incredibly long-term perspectives. So a question I would put to you is, if you wanted to point somebody, either a believer or an unbeliever, to a bigger picture, a longer term perspective, I wonder what sort of scriptures you might turn to. You may want to have a think about that. In our church, we did a series in Ecclesiastes recently, and that was very, very powerful for thinking about that kind of thing. So we've talked about having a core purpose and the power of that in resilience. We've talked about having a longer term view and a bigger picture. So just finally on this longer term view and bigger picture, when I've worked with young leaders coming through, often quite privileged in secular organizations, one of the things I've often required them to do as part of their leadership development is to go and volunteer in contexts that they would never normally touch, or you just encourage them to tune into voluntary organizations that are people who are struggling perhaps with mental health or in social deprivation, various other things. And just the sort of recognition that your current problems are almost certainly not as bad as they feel right now. When our child was very ill many years ago, you know, it felt absolutely awful to us. But then we looked around the sort of intensive care with all these very sick babies and realised that, you know, our child just wasn't as sick as many. And having that view can be helpful. Let me ask you this question. It's leading us into the next bit. But if I was to make this statement to you, I choose what I experience. To what extent do you agree with that for yourself? Now, okay, the frustration that we're not in the room, because we'd have a great conversation about this. It's a wonderful topic for debate, and often a way to sort of open up people's sense of choice, their sense of, you know, whether things are sort of fatalistically determined and so on. It's a great icebreaker with a group of people to get people to sort of get quite deep quite quickly. But this concept of choice. Now, first of all, we believe in a sovereign God, but we also believe in human responsibility. At least that's where I'm coming from. And so, on the one hand, I believe that God is Lord over all, but He has given me free choice, and so I believe personally that I have quite a high choice of sort of what happens to me. But this statement is, I choose what I experience. And the idea that how I experience events is an important area to look at. And let me just take you to a quote from somebody called Viktor Frankl. He was a concentration camp survivor who went on to become a significant psychotherapist. But this was one of his defining sort of perspectives that he contributed to the field. And let's just walk through this step by step. So between stimulus and response, there is a space. So between the thing that happens and how I react, there is a space. In that space lies our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. Now, he wasn't coming from a gospel-centered perspective, but the truth of that ability, that potential to choose how we respond, is a vital thing. And the Bible recognizes, when Paul talks about, I do what I don't want to do, and we recognize the sinfulness in that. But actually, part of discipleship is learning, by the power of the Spirit, learning to make different choices, and there's a huge degree of resilience that comes from that. And Viktor Frankl will attribute that recognition of choice as being a fundamental factor in surviving his experiences. And so what we're describing is this, really, between the event over here on the left and the response over on the right. We're not robots, we're not programmed, although we do live sometimes as if that was the truth. But we need to learn to see what's going on in the space between these two things. So let's have a look. In that space, there is how we think, and there is what happens to us physiologically as well as emotionally. And what we're talking about here, what so many researchers have identified is that how our physiological and emotional response plays out is hugely impacted by how we think about the event that just happened and how we think about ourselves as well. So as Christians, we'd recognize that our heart condition is at play here. So what's in my heart shows up in my reaction. So for example, some particular event happens. If my mindset is, it's not fair, I'm being attacked, why is it always me, they don't appreciate me, all of that kind of thing, then I have this kind of visceral reaction, and my emotions might be all over the place, and my response might be really, really unhelpful and ungodly. But what if I choose to see that gap and remind myself of the gospel in that? What if I learn to think differently and not in my own strength? Well, the event happens, the same event might happen, but I might pause and go, this is not like them. I wonder what else might be going on here. And as a result of that, I'm not so derailed physically and emotionally, which might give me a bit more opportunity to kind of select a better response. And as Christians, we know we can do that in the power of the Spirit. So Ephesians 3 says, for this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named, that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Friends, that's our new reality in Christ. And so our ability to react differently, if we just see that little gap and go, Christ in me, let me respond a little bit differently. So I'm hurtling through some very in-depth material here. Some of you who know this field well will say, this looks very, very much like cognitive behavioral therapy, and it is, and we could have a huge debate about the appropriateness for Christians, but we have the gospel in this. So some of these techniques are helpful, but what we fill that gap with is absolutely vital. It's worth recognizing that there are all sorts of thinking traps that we fall into, and secular work would do a huge amount of put a huge amount of focus on learning to see and resist some of these thinking biases. We would actually recognize that many of these are sin. These are our sort of sinful mindset, but we do fall into these kind of habits, and we don't have time to spell these out in great details, but we can look out for these in ourselves. But when we get to these, we often experience, when we're under enormous pressure, we often experience this wonderful phrase called an amygdala hijack. It's when the red mist comes down, we perhaps turn into a bit of a monster and get that kind of fight or flight response, high emotion, and our ability to think clearly really goes, because we're then operating from a much more kind of fundamental place where emotions rule. And the literature gives us a model that talks about modern threats. So we're no longer threatened in society by lions or bears, but we are threatened by things like status, or threats to our status or our certainty or our autonomy, or people we're related to, or issues of fairness. And often those are the things that kind of spark off that amygdala hijack and cause us to kind of act responsibly. And that's when we're not doing that healthy mind, seeing the gap between the event and the response. And so on. It'll be different things for different people, because we all have our own different idols. But what we can be asking ourselves, or helping each other with, which is, when I'm having that reaction, what am I not believing about God's words and God's promises? It's a natural reaction, but our natural reaction is one that is steeped in sinfulness and idolatry. And you might recognize some of those in yourself. But when we have that reaction under pressure, it's all very well, but we have been hijacked, and it's very, very hard to come back to that. So what do we do about that in that moment? Well, this is where the breathing thing that I referred to earlier comes in. We don't have time to go into this in great detail, but the way our heart rhythm, our heart works, and how it reacts, how we react under those kind of crisis moments, send very powerful signals to the brain and to determine how well the brain is functioning. This is where that kind of red mist moment comes from. And so what do I do about that? Well, part of the answer to that is to breathe, and that's because by adopting a kind of slower, sensible breathing pattern, 6 to 8 breaths per minute, actually changes the heart rhythm, which changes the signals that are sent to the brain, and that gives us the chance to sort of come down from the high, and be able to get back to thinking about the situation, first of all, more rationally, and hopefully with a more gospel-centered perspective on the situation. So, oh goodness, I'm rushing through big issues here. If we were in the room, there's actually some interesting software we can use that we can actually have a look at how changing in breathing patterns affects cognitive function. But you'll have to just, on this occasion, you'll just have to take it from me, and if you're interested, read a little further on it. But if as parents, for instance, or for yourself, or perhaps as a parent, being able to say, teach our children in those moments to stop and breathe first, and then try and deal with the situation. So, you know, instead of kind of shouting back or ending up with the situation spiraling out of control, pausing and breathing. You know, my mother used to say, now just stop and breathe. And you know what? She was right. I needed to stop and breathe. And there is actually good science that says it helps me to deal better with situations. We are fearfully and wonderfully made, and we should tune into that better. Well, I've got a last couple of areas I'm going to skip through really quite quickly. Somebody asked earlier a question about talking to others and so on. And so being aware of the relationships that are going to most help me, not because I want to shut out other relationships. There's a very secular perspective on this. A lot of the secular literature will say, close out the people who are damaging to you and so on. But we do need to think about you know, the sort of relationships that are going to be most helpful to us at times of when we are worn down, when we are lacking resilience, and be intentional about tuning into those relationships and inviting the help, inviting those who will speak the gospel into this, into our situations and our mental state and our heart state. And so one of the things we can do, you know, from time to time is do a bit of a relationship audit and kind of go, you know, have I got a mix of a healthy mix of relationships? Are there some close relationships? Where are the enduring relationships? Are there casual relationships where I'm just able to be a bit more kind of relaxed and not on duty, if you like? Where are the relations? What's the balance between giving and receiving and enjoying and serving? Probably should be on there in my relationships. But also thinking a little bit about how the boundaries in our relationships work. And goodness, we could spend so much time on this, because we vary enormously in how we manage the boundaries of our relationships. Am I too closed so that I'm not allowing other people in to my life and my thoughts and my heart state? Or perhaps I'm too open. It's, you know, it's just all out there. I worked with one particular client, and this was a senior person in an airline company, and she said, you know what I find so draining is my evening conversation with my mother every day. And I said, what? And she rang up and she said, no, my mother rings every evening and spends a whole hour telling me all about her day and all the problems that her friends are going through and so on. And I said to her, I think it's wonderful that you kind of have that sort of relationship with your mother, but do you think you might want to think about changing the conversation, or perhaps the length of it, or perhaps the frequency of it? And she said, oh, I've never thought about that. And I said, well, there is a choice. There is some choice you have. Without cutting your mother out, without hurting her or belittling her, you probably could do something to change that relationship a little bit. Which is being what I would call more intentionally permeable. So instead of having really hard boundaries or no boundaries at all, let's try and be intentionally permeable. So I'm really clear about this. I'm a pastor's wife. I've been in very senior and demanding consulting situations. You know, have family commitments and so on. And so I've been really choiceful about who I'm open with and how and what I'm open with. My inclination would be to be quite closed, but I know that's not godly or healthy for me. But learning to make choices about just being a bit more open in a few more specific ways with a number of people has been really, really helpful. And then the final bit I'm quickly going to cover is to say there are just hundreds of micro choices that we can make around our well-being, and don't underestimate the power of this. So when you're feeling low on resilience, or you're seeing people low on resilience around you, there are some micro choices that you can make. Are you actually getting enough sleep? Are you drinking enough water? How are you eating? You know, are you having some relaxation time? What are those things? Even where are you sitting to work? Most of us got less choice about that at the moment, but hundreds of micro choices that can really impact on our resilience. There's one chief exec of a Christian ministry organization I know who has put a real emphasis on healthy, just healthy lifestyle stuff in the way the office is organized and so on. And I hear back from, you know, I know one or two of the staff in the organization who are really, really positive about the impact that's had.